They buried her legacy under a mountain of lies. But what if the most feared woman in Chinese history was more than just a monster? What if every murder, every betrayal, every whispered scandal was just another brick in the throne she built with her bare hands? Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of the women history tried to erase. The year is 638 AD. In the deepest chamber of the Tang Imperial Palace, a 14-year-old girl is summoned. Her name is Wu Zhao. She is no princess. She has no noble blood. But the emperor wants her. She walks barefoot, past golden dragon pillars, her face calm, her eyes wide open. Every servant knows what happens next. She will be taken as a concubine, another forgotten girl tossed into silk sheets and shadows. But Wu Zhao isn't like the others. She does not cry. She watches, learns, waits. The emperor has a wife, Empress Wang, and she notices the girl too quiet, too smart, too beautiful. Within a year, Wu Zhao isn't just surviving. She's rising. She studies politics, scripture, even military tactics. While others use powder and perfume, she uses silence and memory. And then, the emperor dies. That should have been the end of her. By tradition, imperial concubines with no children are sent to Buddhist convents, hidden away forever. But Wu Zhao escapes fate. She does the unthinkable. She seduces the next emperor, the son of the man she once served. Taizong's heir, now known as Gaozong, brings her back into the palace. Whispers spread like wildfire. Witchcraft, corruption, sin. But none of it stops her. Because Wu knows what the men don't. Power isn't inherited, it's taken. But there's a problem. Gaozong already has an empress, and she knows exactly what Wu is trying to do. Inside the high walls of the inner palace, a war begins, not with swords, but with glances, with gifts, with rumors. Wu gives birth to a daughter, a royal child. But one morning, the baby is found dead in her cradle. The court gasps. Servants run, and Wu stands frozen, holding the lifeless body. Then she turns, calm as ever, and says 4 words that shatter the court. It was the Empress. No one knows what really happened that night. Some say Wu killed her own child. Others believe she staged the scene perfectly. What matters is this. Within weeks, Empress Wang is stripped of her title and banished. Wu Zhao becomes the new Empress of China. But her rise is far from over. Wu is no figurehead. She builds her own intelligence network. Spies in the monasteries, whispers in the army, bribes in the bureaucracy. Ministers who speak against her vanish. Rebellion flares. One general refuses to bow and ends up disappeared on the road to the capital. His headless body, it said, was found days later, wearing a silk scarf tied like a lover's gift. Still, the emperor remains loyal. Blindly, he grows weaker, sicker, and Wu, stronger. When Gaozong collapses during a royal hunt, she takes his seal. The court panics, but it's already too late. For years, she rules behind the curtain, signing decrees, commanding armies, rewriting laws. When Gaozong finally dies, she names herself Empress Dowager, but even that isn't enough. She wants the throne itself. For the first time in Chinese history, a woman prepares to declare herself emperor, not of the harem, not behind the veil, but of all under heaven. The court is paralyzed. Confucian scholars weep, prophecies are forged, and Wu Zhao, she prepares for blood. Because to take the throne, she will have to destroy not just men, but her own family, her own sons, and the very traditions that have kept women like her silent for 1,000 years. And this is only the beginning. They called it madness. A woman wearing the dragon robe. A woman daring to claim the mandate of heaven. The ministers fumbled their scrolls. The priests chanted warnings. The people watched the sky for omens. But Wu Zhao didn't tremble. She was building an empire of her own. Gaozong was dead. Her sons technically were next in line. But Wu had already tasted the throne's heat. She wasn't about to hand it over to weak boys molded by cowardly tutors and trembling eunuchs. So she began to remove them, one by one. Her eldest son, the crown prince, dared to challenge her authority. He whispered of reform, of independence. Within months, he was accused of plotting rebellion and exiled. Another son was forced into retirement. One mysteriously lost his health and vanished from the public eye. Behind palace doors, mothers wept, but Wu never flinched. She appointed herself as regent, then co-ruler, then finally emperor, not empress. That was the title for the emperor's wife. Wu Zhao took the title reserved for men, the son of heaven. And to make sure no one questioned it, she began to rewrite history itself. Stone tablets were carved to justify her reign. Ancient prophecies were discovered, predicting the rise of a great female phoenix. Poets were paid to compare her to mythical goddesses. She even created a new dynasty, the Zhao dynasty, replacing the Tang, if only for a brief period, with her own symbol carved in golden script, the holy and divine sovereign. But behind the incense and scrolls, a darker reality boiled. Wu had enemies everywhere, especially in the court. Former Tang loyalists accused her of heresy. They whispered that she was no phoenix, but a serpent, that her rule was soaked in blood, and they were right. She created the secret police, a network of spies, torturers, and enforcers who reported only to her. Their headquarters, the Luoyang Palace prison, a place known as the Terror Cell. There, ministers were dragged at midnight. Some returned with shattered limbs, others never returned at all. Still, she built. Wu wasn't a tyrant for vanity. She had a vision, and she was ruthless enough to make it real. She lowered taxes on the poor, opened up the civil service exam to people outside aristocracy, appointed competent officials, many of them women, to high posts. Buddhist temples were sponsored. Literacy soared. Agriculture improved. Roads were built. For the first time in centuries, peasants whispered her name with respect. But her family, that was another story. Wu's surviving sons lived in golden cages. They drank poison like wine. One of them, the weakest, was made puppet emperor. He sat on the throne with Wu behind the curtain. Every word he spoke came from her lips. Every law bore her seal. When he became inconvenient, she removed him, coldly, publicly, installed another, and when he dared show ambition, she forced him to commit suicide. No tears, no mourning. The court grew silent. Officials bowed lower. The poetry about her became more exaggerated. The common people dared not speak her name aloud. In the capital, Luoyang, children were warned. If you lie, the Empress will hear you. But behind the terror, there was something else, something even her enemies couldn't deny. Order. Wu kept the realm stable. She crushed rebellions before they began. She balanced Buddhist clergy against Confucian scholars, always ensuring no one faction held too much power. Under her rule, trade flowed across the Silk Road. The imperial court shimmered in gold and lacquer. Artists, thinkers, architects, all flourished under her golden eye. And yet, she was aging. She could feel it in her bones. The once trembling ministers now smirked behind their fans. Her once loyal guards whispered of succession. She knew what they were waiting for. Not her death, her weakness. But Wu wasn't done, not yet. To secure her legacy, she began to build her final masterpiece, the Great Cloud Temple. It would be the tallest, most radiant structure in the empire. A temple to her glory, her ancestors, her divine rule. But it would also serve another purpose, a message, that she wasn't just an emperor, she was a goddess walking among men. She personally approved every stone, oversaw every architect, and while others prayed for a peaceful afterlife, Wu carved her presence into the bones of the earth. But power has a price. Her health declined, her vision blurred, her once fierce voice cracked like old silk. Rumors returned. The ministers were planning a coup. Her own concubines, Beautiful women she had kept in the palace now saw themselves as her successors. They began meeting in secret, whispering, plotting. One night, Wu's favorite consort, a musician with soft eyes and deadly ambition, tried to poison her. She survived, but barely. That's when she made a fateful decision. She would not die in weakness. She would name her heir. The court held its breath. Would she name another son? A relative? A trusted official? Instead, she summoned the ministers and declared, "I choose no one. I was chosen by heaven. Let it choose again." It was an act of defiance, even in frailty, and it shook the empire. Some historians say she abdicated soon after. Others claim she was forced. But all agree on one thing: when Wu Zetian finally stepped down, the throne trembled. She returned to private life in her palace. For months no one saw her. Some feared she'd died. Others believed she had ascended to immortality. And then one cold morning in 705 AD, the woman who ruled with fire and blood died quietly in her bed. But even in death, she controlled the story. Her tomb, shared with Emperor Gaozong, was carved with no epitaph. No words. No lies. Just a silent stone, daring history to speak. And for centuries, it did. Sometimes with venom, sometimes with awe, but never with silence. Because once, in a world built for emperors, there ruled a woman, and her name was Wu Zetian. The empire had never seen anything like it, and never would again. A woman ruled not by seduction or shadow, but by iron, ink, and the edge of a blade. Wu Zetian, the phoenix enthroned, sat upon the dragon throne while the world tried to forget she was ever a woman. Ministers wore their best robes and their deepest fear. Poets composed verses that dared not mention her name but praised the golden sovereign who commanded heaven and earth. And inside the forbidden halls, the real war was only beginning. Wu had destroyed her enemies outside the walls. Now she turned inward, to the women who once bowed to her and now watched her throne with longing. She had brought in dozens of concubines, not for love, but as weapons. One girl could be married off to a noble family and secure loyalty. Another might catch whispers from drunken generals. A third, barely 16, played the piper for Wu each night, her melodies laced with subtle flattery and coded warnings. Worcester's palace became a maze of silk and poison. She knew the rules of the harem game better than anyone. After all, she had played it and won. But the next generation was learning fast. They knew how Wu had killed to rise. They studied her tactics. And now they waited for her to blink. But Wu didn't blink. She turned her private chambers into a battlefield of strategy. She had the walls redraped in black. She positioned mirrors behind the curtains, not for vanity, but to watch who entered and who dared linger. She replaced servants weekly. She kept eunuchs illiterate so they couldn't record what they saw. Her food was tasted thrice. Her water came only from a spring she had sealed. The fear wasn't set paranoia, it was survival. Because someone inside the palace was sending messages to the outside. Scrolls were found hidden in lacquer boxes, signed by a mysterious hand. They detailed court gossip, military troop movements, even false sightings of heavenly omens. The goal was simple: make the people believe the mandate of heaven had shifted, that Wu's rule was over. The ministers began to move, quietly, carefully, and Wu set her trap. She invited her court to a banquet, not a celebration, a test. The grand hall was lit by 1,000 lanterns, red like blood. Silk banners trailed from the ceiling, each embroidered with phrases like "eternal sovereign" and "chosen by heaven." Musicians played in minor keys. The food was served in black porcelain, elegant but cold. And Wu? She watched. Each smile, each bow, each glance shared between nobles who thought themselves unseen. Then she rose. With a single flick of her sleeve, the doors slammed shut. Guards appeared from behind the tapestries. The music stopped. And Wu spoke. Some among you believe I am finished. That age weakens the will. That power can be stolen in whispers. I remind you, it cannot. No one breathed. 3 officials were dragged out. Their scrolls, real and forged, were burned before the court. One man begged, another cursed. The third simply stared into her eyes as if he already knew she would outlive them all. The people outside never knew the truth. The next day, a royal edict was issued. 3 traitors uncovered. The Empress, ever wise, preserves the realm, and the Empire sighed in relief. Order had returned. But inside the palace, something else shifted. Wu had shown strength, but also fear. She knew she couldn't fight time. Her hands trembled in private, her memory flickered at dawn, and so she began her final project, the rewriting of history. She summoned the Empire's best scholars, artists, and monks. Their task was clear: build the myth, seal her place, erase the doubt. Murals were painted showing Wu Yu's divine birth. Books were commissioned that linked her bloodline to ancient sages. Statues were erected, not just of Wu as a ruler, but Wu as a deity, tall, radiant, with dragons bowing and the sun behind her head. But the most important work was invisible. Wu created a secret archive, hidden chambers beneath Luoyang where her letters, journals, and true decrees were locked away. Only a handful of scribes knew of its existence. Their tongues were cut, their eyes covered. They wrote only by dictation and died under guard. She believed that one day, history might want the truth, but not yet. And while her scholars spun legends, her spies kept watching, because far from the capital, a storm was brewing. In the provinces, former Tang loyalists gathered. One in particular, a distant cousin of We's, Prince Zetian, was amassing followers. He claimed Wu had broken the sacred order of succession, that the gods were angry, that the earthquakes and droughts were not natural, but signs. Wu sent envoys. They were murdered. She sent an army. They were ambushed. The rebellion was real. For the first time in over a decade, the throne was shaking, not from whispers but from war drums. Wu knew she couldn't ride into battle. She couldn't wield a sword. But she could do something better. She summoned the Iron General, a fierce woman named Shangguan Wana, once her scribe, now her war strategist. Wana was loyal, brilliant, and feared. She had watched Wu destroy empires and learned every lesson. Together they crafted the response. It wasn't just battle, it was theater. Letters were sent to villages warning them of the rebel prince's madness. Troops were dressed in golden robes to look divine. Monks were paid to declare visions of Wu as the protector of the realm. When the army marched, the banners didn't show swords, they showed phoenixes. And it worked. In 3 weeks, Prince Zetian's forces were scattered. In 6, he was captured. And in 7, he was dead. Executed by decree, his body burned, his name removed from the official histories. Wu had won again. But this time, the victory felt hollow. She stood in the throne room, alone, her back aching. The jade tiles beneath her feet were cold, and for the first time in decades, she didn't feel invincible. She felt mortal. But that didn't mean she was done. No. Zetian still had one final card to play, one move that would echo for centuries. And to make it, she would have to destroy the very thing she loved most. When the Empress consort died mysteriously in her sleep, few dared question it. But behind palace walls, rumors echoed louder than temple bells. Servants whispered that Wu Zetian had her rival strangled with silk cords in the dark. There was no body, only ashes. The official scrolls said death by illness, the truth, locked in fear. That night Wu did not mourn. She stepped barefoot into the Hall of Enlightenment, looked into the cold eyes of the Emperor, and bowed just low enough to satisfy tradition. But this time, he didn't look away. He didn't see a concubine or a grieving widow. He saw a sovereign shadow rising beside him, and something in him feared her, even then. She moved quickly now, Her eldest son, raised by the late Empress, began to show signs of rebellion. He was charming, intelligent, and loyal to another faction. That would not do. She accused him of treason. Poison was found in his wine cup. Some claimed it was suicide. Others swore they saw a maid weep before vanishing into the night. With her son gone, she placed her younger, more malleable boy on the throne. But everyone knew he was a child. It was she who ruled, not behind a veil, not from a quiet chamber. She began holding court in his name, issuing decrees with her own seal, rewriting laws to expand her power. The ministers grumbled, but she crushed dissent with elegance and force. One accused her of overstepping. By nightfall, his estate was burned, and his head rolled down the stone steps of the forbidden city, a crimson trail behind it. She declared he had plotted against the throne. The court fell silent. Silence meant survival. The temples once refused her offerings. The monks said heaven favored male rule, so she built her own temples, commissioned scripts declaring her a divine reincarnation of the Maitreya, the future Buddha. She rewrote scripture to say the savior would come, not as a man, but as a woman born of fire and dragon blood. Her enemies called it blasphemy. Her people, they began to believe. In the southern provinces, rebellion flared. Her army marched under banners, not of the emperor, but of her name. Wu summoned her generals, dressed in crimson armor, and vowed to extinguish the revolt herself. Her orders were ruthless. Burn the grain, drown the fields, and let their mothers weep. She watched from atop a black steed as villages burned. When her general returned with the rebel leaders' severed hands, she did not blink. She declared a new law. All who challenged her reign would be erased from history. And so they were, names scratched from tombs, records torched in silence. Back in the capital, she built a secret police force, loyal only to her. They wore black robes, moved at night, and answered to no one. Ministers who once plotted in shadows now stared over their shoulders, uncertain if the next scroll handed to them bore an imperial favor or a death sentence. But Wu had learned well. Fear alone was not enough. She extended grain supplies to the poor, rebuilt irrigation systems, lowered taxes for farmers and gave them land, something no emperor had dared. In villages across China, peasants carved her name into wood and stone. They called her Holy Mother, a title once reserved only for myth. Still, the court burned with resentment. The nobles, the aristocrats, the men, especially the men, could not accept it. A woman seated on the dragon throne? It was unthinkable. It was treason to the heavens. So she turned the tide. In a grand midnight ceremony surrounded by priests she had appointed, Wu Zetian walked into the Hall of Supreme Harmony and proclaimed herself Emperor of the Zhou Dynasty. Not Empress, not Regent, Emperor. She wore the yellow robe reserved only for the Son of Heaven, and no one stopped her. The Emperor, her own son, was quietly removed, placed in a meditative retreat. Some say he lived out his days locked in a garden. Others claim he was poisoned by moonlight. Wu never spoke of it again. From that day forward, every seal bore her name. Every edict began with her words. She renamed the empire, reshaped its laws, and issued coins with her image, not beside a man, not as a wife or mother, but alone, crowned supreme. She was no longer the girl who served tea to a man she once loved. She had become something else, something new, a shadow cast across every dynasty that would follow. And while poets would later sing of her cruelty, the farmers remembered her reign, the bridges she built, the peace she brokered. But even a throne built on blood cannot last forever, and the deeper she carved her name into history, the more enemies she awakened beneath it. Because power is never quiet. It stirs the dead, rattles old alliances, and sets traps in silk. And in Wu Zetian's palace, every smile had a blade behind it, even hers. The dragon throne stood silent beneath the coiled serpents of its golden canopy, but the whispers surrounding it were anything but still. Inside the palace walls, the air was dense with incense and paranoia. Servants walked slower now. Ministers spoke in hushed tones, weighing every word like it might be their last. Because Wu Zetian wasn't just watching, she was listening. Her rise had become unstoppable, but there was one final transformation left. She would no longer rule through others. Not as a consort, not as a regent, she would crown herself emperor, the first and only woman in Chinese history to ever do so. But before that, the old dynasty had to be purged, not just its leaders, its memories. It began with the name of the dead, former Empress Wang and the beloved concubine Zhao. Their graves were desecrated by imperial order, their tomb inscriptions erased, their names struck from official records. The message was chillingly clear. If Wu Zetian could destroy you in life, she could erase you in death. But she didn't stop with the dead. Chancellor Shangguan Yi, one of the few who dared to oppose her, sent a memorial denouncing her behavior. The response was swift. He was accused of treason, dragged through the capital in chains, and executed with his entire family. His granddaughter, a young court poet named Shangguan Wan, was spared only because Wu recognized her brilliance. But even that mercy was twisted. Wan became Wu Yu's personal scribe, a constant reminder that the line between honor and humiliation could vanish with a single imperial sigh. Behind the curtain of BU's growing power, her secret police flourished like shadows. They were called the Control Bureau, but everyone knew what they really were: spies, torturers, executioners. Neighbors disappeared overnight. Ministers took their own lives rather than risk arrest. Even the birds seemed to fly lower around Luoyang, as if afraid of what they might see. Still, Wu's reforms won her the loyalty of the people. She lowered taxes, expanded the imperial exam system, and promoted scholars based on merit rather than birth. Peasant women, once invisible, suddenly had advocates in court. Buddhist monks spoke her name with reverence. For some, she was a visionary. For others, a tyrant. But for all, she was a force of nature. And yet, even nature fears betrayal. One night, inside the Phoenix Hall, Wu sat cloaked in deep purple robes. Her fingers traced the jade armrest as eunuchs whispered news from the west. One of her own sons, Li Xian, born of her own womb, had begun forming alliances. Not loud, not foolish, but quietly, cleverly. That was worse. She had already exiled him once, suspecting rebellion. But this time was different. The imperial astrologers had reported signs of imbalance in the heavens: a lunar eclipse during the spring festival, a comet seen over Chang'an. Wu was not superstitious, but she knew how power worked. If the people believed her rule was cursed, her enemies would follow suit. So she did what only someone like her could do. She stripped Li Xian of his titles. Then she summoned him home, not for punishment, but for reconciliation. A mother's embrace, a feast, wine, music. He never left alive. No official record marked the prince's cause of death. No inquest was held. No tomb was built with honor. Just silence. And in the silence, everyone understood. Blood was no longer thicker than ambition. The throne had consumed her. Or perhaps she had always been the throne's true nature, hidden behind silk veils and soft smiles. But she didn't stop there. She had her surviving sons kneel before her in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, swearing allegiance not just to her rule, but to her dynasty. Not the Tang, the Zhao, her dynasty. She had revived the ancient name and crowned herself the sovereign of a new age. Not as Empress, but as Emperor. The mandate of heaven, she declared, had passed through her veins alone. And then, in a moment that would ripple across millennia, Wu Zetian stepped onto the dragon throne. She wore the imperial crown with 12 jade beads, reserved only for the Son of Heaven. Her proclamation declared her not as His Majesty, but as sacred and divine. The court bowed lower than ever before. No one dared look her in the eye. Outside, commoners whispered her new name in the markets. Children recited her edicts like songs. And yet, in the shadows, the old guard fumed. Scholar officials clutched Confucian texts, railing against a woman desecrating the natural order. The hen does not crow at dawn, one wrote, meaning women should never rule. Wu had those scrolls burned. And the scholars who wrote them? Some vanished. Others were reassigned to far provinces, quiet, cold places where ideas went to die. Still, not everything could be silenced. Inside her own palace, fear took on new forms. Servants began to dream of her eyes. Ministers kept candles lit all night to avoid sleeping too deeply. Poison became an art form. Accusations flew like arrows. Eunuchs whispered into her ears that her niece had been seen laughing too freely in court, that her cousin's son was amassing too many favors, that a monk had predicted her fall. She listened, and each time she acted. Beheadings returned to the public square. Not often, just enough to remind the people that peace was a privilege, not a right. Still, there were moments when the Empress turned Emperor stood alone in her private chambers, staring into the bronze mirror carved with phoenixes. Time had not been kind. Her hair was now inked black by court painters. Her hands bore the fine tremble of age. But her eyes, they still burned. She remembered being 14, discarded and sent to the convent. She remembered the first taste of betrayal. She remembered the warmth of a dead baby in her arms, taken too soon, or perhaps taken by her own hands. And she remembered how power had never come wrapped in kindness. It had come wrapped in blood. One evening, as the court prepared for the autumn harvest, Wu ordered a great mural to be painted across the palace wall. It showed a phoenix rising from a field of ash, wings spread wide, flames licking the clouds. At the mural's base was a single woman, cloaked in red, one foot placed upon the body of a dragon. Some said it was art, others said it was prophecy. And in the shadows, even her most loyal allies began to wonder, how far would she go to keep what she had built, and at what cost? The palace had changed. Once filled with the laughter of concubines and the soft shuffle of silk slippers down jade-tiled corridors, it now echoed with the distant clang of armored boots and the whispers of fear. Wu Zetian, Empress of the Zhao Dynasty, stood at the pinnacle of her power, but the higher she rose, the colder the air became. She had claimed the throne of an empire that had never known a female ruler and reshaped it in her own image. But shadows grew long even under a burning sun. From behind the dragon-shaped lattice screens, she observed her ministers in silence. Men who once looked at her with disdain now bowed so low they trembled. But Wu no longer trusted even their humility. Loyalty had become a mask, and she had learned brutally that behind every bowed head could lie the blade of a traitor. Her spies, known as the Secret Bureau of the Inner Palace, roamed every corner of the empire. Informants sat at temples, tea houses, even in the private chambers of her own sons, and yet she never felt secure. One by one, she began purging those who whispered disloyalty. The great Chancellor Di Renji, once her most trusted advisor, disappeared for days before being found exiled in disgrace. His only crime? Cautioning her against expanding her secret police. Another general, whose victories had once earned him jade medallions, was arrested in the middle of a feast. A note had arrived anonymously, accusing him of speaking her name in vain after too many cups of wine. The emperor's hand no longer signed decrees. Wu's own seal burned red into every edict of life and death. At night, she walked her private garden alone, flanked only by 2 eunuchs, whose tongues she had removed years ago. There, beneath the moonlight, she spoke to the ghosts only she could hear. Her baby daughter, the one she had allegedly smothered to frame the Empress Wang, sometimes appeared in the reflection of the koi pond, her eyes wide and unblinking. The executed consorts and poisoned siblings haunted her corridors in silence, their judgment never spoken but always felt. Wu did not flinch from them. She welcomed the ghosts, for they too had been tools on her path to power. But outside the palace, murmurs began to stir. The peasants, once awed by the sight of a female ruler who issued tax reforms and opened monasteries to women, were growing restless again. A drought in the northern provinces had killed the crops, and the rice shipments from the south were delayed. Famine meant rebellion, and rebellion meant weakness. Uyu's astrologers warned her that the heavens were displeased. A comet had passed over Luoyang. Superstition ran deep. Even her own son, Li Shen, who once wrote poems about her strength, now wrote letters in secret to Buddhist monks, hinting that the Empress's mandate was breaking. She summoned him to court and watched him kneel. His eyes had changed. He was no longer the obedient child who had clung to her robes, crying after nightmares. He was a man now, and men in the Imperial court had only two roles, ally or threat. Wu smiled, but her heart tightened. That evening, he was assigned a new estate far from the capital, for reflection and scholarly pursuits. Weeks later, the estate burned under suspicious circumstances. No body was recovered. Wu never spoke of him again. By the time Wu was 60, her reign had become myth. She had commissioned a series of statues depicting her as the female incarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. Monasteries across China began to display scrolls of her face, haloed in gold, the Divine Mother, the enlightened ruler, the heavenly phoenix. Yet even her most devoted followers whispered that she had become unreachable. The walls of her palace thickened. Her meals were tested by 4 tasters before they reached her lips. No male was allowed to remain armed in her presence, not even the generals. One day, a minister from a distant province dared to present her with a petition. It spoke not of treason but of concern that the people no longer saw her as their ruler, but as a goddess above suffering. He warned that deification would isolate her from the blood of the people that had lifted her. Wu listened. She nodded. Then she ordered his arrest, not for the petition but for suspicion of falsifying grain reports. No trial followed. His head was hung at the gates of Luoyang within days. But power, as she had always known, is a double-edged blade. Whispers began to grow within her own court. Eunuchs once loyal only to her began accepting bribes from former Tang loyalists. Her own nephews, whom she had elevated to princely titles, began plotting from within. And deep in her private archive, a collection of letters, names, and confessions, she discovered something that shook even her. A list. A list of names, written in calligraphy too precise to be accidental. Ministers, commanders, priests, servants, even concubines, all marked with a tiny crimson stamp, replace. The handwriting was hers, but she had never written it, or had she? Memory had begun to play tricks on her. Was it her vision that blurred, or her past? She clutched the scroll and wept, not out of sadness, but out of terror, not at the betrayal, but at the possibility that she had written it and forgotten. That night, she ordered every mirror in the palace to be removed. No reflection should confront her. No woman should dare to look back at her and ask, "What have you become?" Wu Zetian ruled alone for over 15 years, longer than many emperors who came before her. Under her iron will, the arts flourished, trade expanded, and Buddhism became a central pillar of Chinese identity. But her rule was built on sand soaked with blood, and even she knew that no empire lasted forever. As her hair whitened and her body weakened, she turned to one last obsession: legacy. She commissioned a tomb unlike any other, its facade carved with dragons, lions, and phoenixes. But at the center of it, a smooth tablet stood, blank. She instructed that no words be inscribed upon it, no name, no title, no epitaph. Let history judge her. Let time decide whether she was a monster or a miracle. In that gesture, perhaps for the first time, Wu Zetian became mortal again, but not powerless. Even in silence, the stone spoke louder than her enemies ever could. And in the hushed corridors of the Forbidden City, where young women still whispered her name in awe and fear, her legend refused to die. It was in the cold hush of an early dawn that Wu Zetian stood at the threshold of her own legacy. The Forbidden City lay still beneath the drifting mists of winter, but inside her walls, fires were beginning to burn, not in the hearths, but behind eyes. Her enemies no longer wore the robes of exiled scholars or frightened court women. They shared her blood. The Empress, now aged yet unyielding, had built an empire upon intelligence, ambition, and ruthless calculation. But age does not slow whispers. It sharpens them. Inside her own palace, Her sons, Zetian and Dan, walked with steps too careful, spoke with words too calculated. And her courtiers, those who had once bowed with trembling devotion, now exchanged glances they thought she couldn't see. She saw them all. But it wasn't fear that crept in her veins that morning. It was betrayal. Zetian, once her favored heir before his exile, had returned with quiet rage stitched into his silk robes. He smiled too much, bowed too low. Rumors had begun to reach the Empress. Rumors of his meetings with Confucian loyalists, of his plans to restore the Tang, and of his belief that the empire should never have been in the hands of a woman. Her son, her own son, now plotted her fall in the name of tradition. So she summoned him. The hall of supreme harmony rang with silence as Zetian entered, his shadow falling long before him. Zetian sat on the dragon throne, not as a mother, but as the absolute monarch of China. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was bound beneath a golden phoenix crown. Her eyes, unchanged since her youth, glittered with fire. "Do you still believe the throne belongs to your father?" she asked softly. Zetian didn't answer. His silence was louder than rebellion. Zetian gestured. Guards moved in, silent and merciless. He was dragged from the hall not as a prince, but as a traitor. And once again, blood sealed her power. But the punishment only deepened the cracks beneath her empire. Whispers turned to murmurs. Officials began secretly aligning with her younger son, Dan, whose demeanor was careful, submissive, too submissive. Behind his hunched shoulders and quiet voice, she sensed a calculation equal to her own. But she needed him. Her reign had weathered decades of storms, but age was the one enemy she could not behead. She named Dan as her heir. For now, she still ruled from the throne, issuing edicts from her private quarters, surrounded by monks, mystics, and those who swore loyalty not to the Tang dynasty, but to her new dynasty. But the palace was no longer the machine of absolute control it once was. Her health faltered. Fainting spells followed her into council meetings, and behind the curtains, the court buzzed with anticipation. A coup was coming, not from soldiers, but from servants, not from generals, but from within her own inner circle. One night, as rain lashed the Imperial tiles, Zetian awoke to a bitter chill. Her favorite concubine, Shangguanwana, the brilliant poet and political advisor who had once been her voice to the court, was gone. She had vanished without a trace. Then came the final fracture. Two of her most trusted ministers, the Zhang brothers, were found dead, strangled in their sleep, their throats slit with a ceremonial dagger. Their bodies were dumped in the river with the imperial seal still clutched in one's hand. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. The court had moved against her. The next morning, Zetian did not rise from her chamber. She lay surrounded by incense, gold, and whispers. The Empress, who had risen from concubine to ruler of the world's greatest empire, was no longer supreme. The Tang loyalists, led by Dan, forced her to abdicate. She did not fight. Not this time. She simply whispered, "You are all here because I let you live," and signed the scroll. With a stroke of the brush, China's only empress regnant stepped down, and the Tang dynasty was restored. But her throne, her legend, and her terror did not fade. Even in death, no woman ever ruled China again, because she had made sure they would never forget what happened the last time one did. The drums were no longer sounding, the eunuchs no longer bowed with fear, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the Forbidden City felt cold, not from winter winds but from the absence of control. Empress Zetian sat alone in her private hall, the scent of incense thick around her, watching the reflection of candlelight dance across her polished obsidian table. The woman who once ruled all under heaven now faced a silence louder than war drums. The empire she bled for was already slipping from her grasp. Her sons were circling like vultures. The ministers she once handpicked were whispering behind golden screens. And the people, though still forbidden to speak her name in vain, had begun to breathe again, quietly, hopefully. Wu was aging, and they knew it. She knew it, and for the first time, her power felt borrowed. But she refused to go down as just a footnote. She summoned her council. Her two favorites, Zhang Yizi and Zhang Changzong, brothers she'd elevated from common entertainers to imperial advisors, stood beside her throne like jeweled ornaments. Rumors swirled of her favoritism, of their nighttime visits, of influence traded for intimacy. She didn't care. They had been loyal, and loyalty was rare, until it wasn't it. A coup formed in whispers, led by her own former allies, including her son Li Shen, once banished, now emboldened. They moved in the shadows of the palace, bribing guards, promising favor. On a cold morning, the door to the Empress's chamber slammed open. Soldiers stormed in, not enemies from distant lands, but her own people. She looked up from her silk-covered bed, calm. She did not scream. She did not run. Because Wu Zetian understood the final act of power is knowing when to surrender with grace and when to remain unforgettable in defeat. They dragged the Zhang brothers before her and slit their throats at her feet. Blood splattered across her silk cover. Still, she did not flinch. She knew what they wanted: her abdication, her silence, her disappearance from the throne, and eventually from the records. She handed over the Imperial seal. Her reign had ended, but the Empire still bore her mark. They tried to erase her. Historians downplayed her brilliance and obsessed over her cruelty. They mocked her relationships, invented stories of lust and manipulation. They claimed she murdered her own daughter, that she ruled with poison and mirrors, that her ambition had no soul. And maybe some of it was true, but none of them could undo the fact that she had once worn the dragon robes, not as consort, not as regent, but as emperor. She was the only woman in Chinese history to claim the mandate of heaven for herself. Even in exile, confined to a small palace, Wu Zetian continued to write. She dictated her version of events, instructed her scribes to record her thoughts, not just on governance but on fate, legacy, and the burden of breaking history. Some records say she grew quiet in her last years. Others say she remained sharp until the end, smiling even as death approached. She died in 705 AD. Her tombstone was left intentionally blank. No name, no titles, no achievements, as if the world couldn't agree on how to remember her. But the people did. They whispered her name with awe and fear. They visited her tomb in secret. They told stories to their children of the woman who once ruled them all, who rose from a concubine to a god. And over time, the legend only grew stronger. Centuries later, women scholars would uncover her hidden writings. Feminists would name her as a symbol of defiance. Artists would paint her in stormy hues, half myth, half truth. And today, in the ruins of ancient Luoyang, tourists still stand before her empty stele, wondering what kind of story she might have written if she'd been the one holding the brush. Was she a tyrant? A savior? A mother? A monster? Maybe all of them. But one truth remains unshaken across centuries. Wu Zetian rewrote the rules of power and dared the world to follow. If you were captivated by her journey from concubine to emperor, imagine how many more stories remain buried in forgotten scrolls, sealed tombs, and erased history books. Subscribe to The Untold Woman now, and join us as we uncover the empresses, outlaws, and legends history tried to silence. Your next obsession is just one video away.